Today's video is brought to you by Surfshark, the all-in-one online security tool that's packed with features to protect your privacy. Online threats are everywhere, but Surfshark is here to help. Whether you're securing your data, protecting your identity, or bypassing geo-restrictions for streaming, Surfshark has you covered. With unlimited devices on one account, you can secure your entire household with ease. It also includes amazing features like Surfshark Alert, which notifies you if your personal information gets leaked, and Surfshark Search, an ad-free private search engine. Plus, if you're not happy, their 30-day money-back guarantee means you can try it risk-free. So, go to surfshark.com/ITS to sign up and get 4 extra months for free. That's surfshark.com/ITS. Your data deserves the best protection, so it deserves Surfshark. And now, today's video. It was the early hours of the 15th of April, 1912. On the evening of the 4th day of her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, the lauded ocean liner RMS Titanic had a collision with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. She foundered 2.5 hours later, with around 2,224 people on board. Around 1,500 of them perished. Among those who died that evening were people from all walks of life and economic classes, from impoverished immigrants seeking a new life in New York to some of the wealthiest people in the world. The ocean did not distinguish. Those who went down with the ship included a captain and most of the crew, as well as naval architect Thomas Andrews, who designed the vessel. But one person who did survive the tragedy was Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, which commissions and owns the Titanic. Ismay had decided to travel on the liner's maiden voyage to see the heralded ship sail to New York in full splendor. But although Ismay physically survived the sinking, April the 15th, 1912 was the end of his life too. To this day, Ismay's Wikipedia introduction includes what could rank, without context, as one of the website's most strangely worded entries. He was the highest-ranking White Star official to survive the 1912 sinking of the company's flagship RMS Titanic, for which he was widely criticized. Now, Ismay had been born into great wealth and inherited control of the White Star shipping line from his father, Thomas Henry Ismay. Ismay Jr. had a keen mind for business and built the company into the dominant force in maritime travel around the turn of the century. Under his directorship, White Star Line began to develop new ocean liners known for grandeur and luxury. This included the so-called Big Four: the RMS Celtic, the RMS Cedric, the RMS Baltic, and the RMS Adriatic. Ismay announced plans for the RMS Titanic in 1907. She was intended to feature style and luxury, unparalleled even by the great liners which preceded her. Construction of the vessel began in 1909 and no expense was spared. The ship cost the company $7.5 million. That's around $220 million today. She was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast and designed by respected shipbuilder Thomas Andrews. The Titanic was the largest ocean liner in the world when completed in 1912. It was later mythicized that the Titanic had been believed to be unsinkable. While this was untrue, she had been described as practically unsinkable by her builders and various publications before she launched. The ship featured 16 compartments, which could easily be sealed with cast iron doors in case of emergency, and could also remain afloat, even with 4 of these compartments flooded. But of course, the Titanic was very much sinkable. This fact was proven the night that she careened into a massive iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. As the ship foundered, it was clear that the majority of those on board would go down with her. Ismay escaped the sinking with his life, only one of 138 male passengers to do so, according to a later US-led inquiry. 678 died, including many of the aforementioned first-class ticket holders, such as Benjamin Guggenheim, John Jacob Astor, and Isidor Straus, who perished alongside his wife Ida. When counting crew members, it was determined that a total of 1,517 souls had been lost, of whom 1,360 were men. Being one of the few men who'd survived was a bad look for the chairman of the company which owned the ship. But Ismay was handed a terrible choice that night, one of the few people to be presented with such a choice. As the lifecraft was being lowered, visibly not about to take anyone else, but with room still on board, he realized he could climb into it. As it happened, the lifeboat was Engelhart Collapsible C, the last to leave the Titanic before she sank. Ismay's other option would have been quite clear: to take a step back and gallantly await what was likely to be a very unpleasant death. This, while probably suspecting that his self-sacrifice wouldn't gain many headlines, while the foundering of the ship he'd commissioned would. Unlike many of the other first-class passengers on board, Ismay had traveled alone on the Titanic, having boarded from the ship's origin point in Southampton. His wife and their 4 children were safely home in England. His eldest child, Margaret, had gotten married 3 weeks before the ship sailed, and his youngest, George, was soon to turn 10 years old. Ismay made his choice, and he boarded the lifeboat. He wasn't alone and was accompanied by William Ernest Carter, a millionaire Pennsylvania stockbroker and polo player, and another member of the aristocratic community on board the Titanic. Carter and Ismay rode collapsible sea until it was reached by the Carpathia, whereupon they and the remainder of their group were rescued. Within hours, news of the disaster spread to the US. This iconic news headline from the New York Times appeared in print the same day as the disaster, announcing known details of the vessel's demise and prominently declaring that Ismay had been saved while at least 1,250 others had perished. The press would swiftly be damning for the White Star Line chairman. On board the Carpathia, Ismay's world unraveled. According to accounts of people who visited him, Ismay was inconsolable, absent and frozen. He consumed very little and remained in shock for days after the event. An inquiry into the disaster was established 4 days after the sinking, overseen by the US Senate. The inquiry explored the details of the event and also examined accounts of Ismay's actions. Contrary to many subsequent rumors, the inquiry did not find Ismay personally guilty of any malfeasance. It also did not find that White Star Line had been negligent under existing maritime laws, as they had followed standard practices of the time. It did find that those practices were insufficient, that complacency had been prevalent aboard the ship, and perhaps most controversially, that Captain Edward Smith had, quote, shown an indifference to danger that was one of the direct and contributing causes of this unnecessary tragedy. Senator Alden Smith, chair of the inquiry, also scathingly criticized the British Board of Trade, stating, "We shall leave to the honest judgment of England its painstaking chastisement of the British Board of Trade, to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality." At around the same time, the British Board of Trade conducted its own investigation into the disaster. In its report, it concurred that there were no flaws with the Titanic under existing maritime laws, which included the lack of adequate lifeboats, but did not find Smith liable for an unruly course taken by the vessel. It also rejected its own culpability for the sinking. Both inquiries found that maritime practices at the time were insufficient, but this was not within the purview of control of either White Star Line or its parent company, the US-based International Mercantile Maritime Company. And neither inquiry found J. Bruce Ismay guilty of any wrongdoing. But none of this saved Ismay from the ire of the public. Among the colorful nicknames he received was J. Brute Ismay. But it was the moniker, the coward of the Titanic, which followed him closest for the rest of his life. He wasn't the only one subject to fairly dismal treatment. William Carter's wife divorced him, claiming he abandoned her and the children during the ailing hours as the Titanic sank. However, she only did so almost 2 years later, and only after Carter had suffered severe injuries in a polo accident which ended his career. Carter never remarried and steadfastly disputed that he'd ever abandoned anyone. His wife, curiously, even for the time, remarried 2 months after the divorce was granted to another prominent figure from Philadelphia high society. Still, Carter's fate was not as bad as Ismay's, as he continued to live a high-rolling life in spite of the shame they shared of having lived out the tragedy. Ismay's reality was different. As the chairman of the White Star Line, it was seen as almost a morose duty to go down with the ship, as Captain Edward Smith and shipbuilder Thomas Andrews had done. Now, many of the circumstances from that night, and rumoured or confirmed events which preceded it, meant that severe criticism of Ismay was just unavoidable. For one thing, the severe undercount of lifeboats was held as one of the central reasons why so many passengers lost their lives. Despite being built to accommodate 2,400 passengers and crew, the Titanic did not have nearly enough collapsible boats to save all on board. The requisite number would have been 48. The Titanic only had 20, a decision made by Ismay, and enough to save less than 1,200 people. The subsequent inquiries recommended strict regulation on the number of such crafts a ship must have, which must be the same as the amount of people on board. With that said, even if there had been more lifeboats on board, it may have made little difference under the circumstances. The Titanic staff had a little over 2 hours to stuff as many people into the boats as possible amidst rising fear and chaos, and while no doubt aware that many of the crew themselves were doomed, they would have had to ensure women and children entered first, as was policy at the time. But as shown by the fact that some of the lifeboats departed the Titanic half-filled, to transfer all the passengers into the boats really wasn't achievable in the short window before the vessel sank, and may have been impossible in all but the most snail-paced sinking. The average occupancy rate of the collapsibles as the ship sank was later found to be around 60%. Therefore, the absence of lifeboats argument was probably overused to Ismay's great detriment. In actual fact, Ismay's choice to have 20 boats on board exceeded the British Board of Trade's requirements at the time, which was just 16 lifeboats. Other reports of Ismay's boorish behaviour also circulated, including that it pressured Captain Edward Smith to sail at full speed in precarious waters to ensure favourable press coverage. But there is little to substantiate this, and the report appears to stem from the testimony of Elizabeth Lyons, a first-class passenger who survived the sinking and made the claim in a deposition to the US inquiry. However, the logic of inconveniencing one's own passengers by sailing them into an empty dock wouldn't really have been any grace to Ismay. The rumoured encounter nevertheless wrote its way into Ismay's unfavourable depiction in the 1997 film Titanic. According to historian Paul Luden-Brown, a consultant on the film set, the scene was included simply because it was what the public expected to see. He further stated in regard to the alleged encounter between Ismay and Smith, quote, "Every single filmmaker has found that portrayal to be too delicious not to incorporate into their film." One of Ismay's most vitriolic critics was William Randolph Hearst, a media magnate and pioneer of the tabloid press. The two had fallen out before the sinking of the Titanic, and savage criticism of Ismay soon came by way of Hearst's yellow paper empire. It's thought that it was Hearst who came up with the derisive nickname J. Brute Ismay, which appeared in a full-page cartoon depicting Ismay in a lifeboat watching the sinking Titanic. Another of Hearst's publications ran with the heading, "We respectfully suggest that the emblem of the White Star Line be changed to that of a yellow liver." Hearst, coincidentally, was the inspiration for the titular character in the 1941 drama film Citizen Kane. In the film, Charles Foster Kane is depicted as an arrogant and cold-hearted newspaper publisher. Despite being later held by many as the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane failed at the box office and received acclaim only in the 1950s, probably in part because Hearst prohibited all promotion of the film across his media empire. In some ways, Ismay's story was a consequence of the thinking of the time, which devoted great interest to the lives of the wealthy and much stock in the details of their lives. Titanic had been built primarily as a vessel of class and luxury, and to be seen on board as she crossed the Atlantic for the first time was a thing of great prestige. She was filled with some of high society's most recognizable names, including mining magnate Benjamin Guggenheim, politician and businessman Isidor Straus, and real estate multimillionaire John Jacob Astor IV. But it was this preoccupation with the lives of the rich and the famous which brought Ismay directly into the scope of the public following the disaster. From the very first news reports, Ismay's name was prominently listed as having survived, and his image remained in constant circulation amid coverage of his testimony. Aside from the hounding by Hearst's press, it was this exposé which made Ismay subject to much of the public's own moralizing regarding the events. In general, aristocrats were, at least publicly, held to the higher moral standards of the Edwardian era, bound to nations of chivalry and duty, which included fastidiousness in the face of great danger. It was this kind of thinking which saw men sign up in droves for the killing fields of France and Belgium as World War I erupted 2 years later. Men of this period, young and old, of all nationalities and economic classes, were expected to dutifully commit their lives to the great conflicts of the 20th century. Conflicts which regularly offered little other than slaughter. The Ismay family was no different. J. Bruce Ismay's youngest son George was killed in action while serving with the British Army in Tunisia in 1943. Perhaps graciously, Ismay was at least saved this final horror. He died of a stroke in 1937, having never mentally recovered from the sinking. And in some ways, Ismay likely permitted the vicious dismantling of his name by resigning himself to the misery which affected him for the rest of his life. He already suffered from insecurity before the sinking and regressed further in following years, towards near despondence. A year after the sinking, Ismay stepped down from White Star Line. Before doing so, he donated a significant sum to a fund for widows of the disaster and helped pay out compensation to victims' relatives. Ismay spent the following years working on insurance claims with a company that his father had founded, issuing hundreds of thousands of pounds to relatives of Titanic victims. In the wake of the disaster, Ismay was rejected by London's high society and became a recluse. He retreated with his wife to a cottage in the west of Ireland, a location he chose for its remoteness and his access to salmon and trout fishing. Despite the isolation, Ismay didn't escape the quiet ridicule of locals who referred to him in Irish Gaelic as Brúisí's me, or push me down, a play on his name Bruce Ismay and a coy reference to the pushing down of the lifeboat which saved him. Ismay continued spending much time at the cottage for the rest of his years, and he never spoke publicly or privately about the tragedy. In later life, he was described as a corpse by his granddaughter, and the subject of Titanic became family taboo. But at Christmas dinner in 1936, shortly before his death, he was asked by one of his grandsons if it had ever been shipwrecked. It is said that in that moment, Ismay finally broke his silence on the disaster. He turned to his grandson and replied, "Yes, I was once in a ship which was believed to be unsinkable." Despite his troubled life, and unlike William Carter, Ismay's wife Florence didn't divorce him, and the couple remained married for a total of 49 years until his death. She didn't remarry and died at the age of 96. in 1963. The White Star Line continued in operation for several decades, but suffered another calamity during World War I. The HMS Britannic, which had been requisitioned as a hospital ship for the British Army, struck a naval mine in the Aegean Sea and sank at the cost of 30 lives. The Britannic became the largest ship lost during the conflict. White Star Line teetered on the brink of bankruptcy following the financial recession of 1929 and was ultimately merged with another company in 1934. Despite the miserable end to his life, Ismay's misfortune continued beyond the grave. He was subject to dishonorable depictions in practically every film or series made about the tragedy in the time after his death. In 1997, the James Cameron-directed epic film Titanic was released with a budget greater than the cost of building the actual ship when adjusted to modern figures. In it, Ismay, played by English actor Jonathan Hyde, is depicted as an aloof and detached aristocrat who seizes the opportunity to abscond in a descending lifeboat alone as the ship begins to sink. No mention of Carter is made in the scene, and emphasis is placed on Ismay's pitiful avoidance of the gaze of a nearby sailor as the boat descends. The film was acclaimed, but did receive criticism for inaccurate or unfair depictions of some historical figures. One such character was Scottish First Officer William Murdoch, ironically the man whose gaze Ismay avoided in the lifeboat scene. Murdoch was depicted as a brash and indecisive figure who accepted a bribe as the ship sank and shot dead a third-class passenger amidst the chaos before shooting himself. Murdoch had generally been held as having heroically worked to minimize loss of life as the ship sank, and the depiction was met with outrage by his descendants and residents of his hometown, Dalbeattie. Cameron later issued an apology for Murdoch's portrayal, and a donation of £5,000 was made by Fox to Dalbeattie High School. However, no such retrospection was applied to Ismay, and his image remained butchered, as had been the case since the sinking. In the 2012 centennial miniseries Titanic, produced by British filmmaker and conservative peer Julian Fellowes, Ismay is depicted as a brutish man who locks crew members below deck, sealing their fate. He is also portrayed as racist toward the Italian waiters at the Titanic's dining hall, including its manager Luigi Gatti, who in real life Ismay had personally hired to run the a la carte restaurant on board. For years, the only clemency issued to Ismay came from some film fan forums and several isolated media articles posing the relatively backhanded question whether he should be forgiven. But the sacrilege name of J. Bruce Ismay did receive some respite with the publishing of a new book in 2022. Understanding J. Bruce Ismay was written by one of Ismay's distant relatives and attempted to shine a new light on his actions on the night of the disaster. The book pointed to the fact, attested to by multiple survivors, that Ismay worked tirelessly in the 2 hours before the ship sank to usher panicking passengers into lifeboats. He was described as strictly adhering to the women and children first policy and also insisting that a stewardess be admitted to a lifeboat, dismissing her hesitance due to her status as a crew member. The book also pointed to the dubiousness of the infamous discussion overheard by Elizabeth Lines, as well as the unrelenting smear campaign to which Ismay was subjected by Hearst's American press. Yet ironically, perhaps the most cogent defiance of Ismay's actions that night can be traced all the way back to 1 month after it took place. In his report for the British Inquiry, Committee Chairman Lord Mersey declared, quote, "As for the attack on Mr. Bruce Ismay, it resolved itself into the suggestion that some moral duty was imposed upon him to wait on board until the vessel had foundered. I do not agree. Mr. Ismay, after rendering assistance to many passengers, found sea collapsible, the last boat on the starboard side actually being lowered. Had he not jumped, he would simply have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of those lost."